Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to this first talk of the year of the Rotman series. The speaker today, Peter Godfrey-Smith from CUNY. Peter has contributed in philosophy, in many fields of philosophy of science in general, philosophy of biology a lot, philosophy of mind, metaphysics to a certain extent, and what some of his interests is communication and science and communication. And so today he's going to talk about memory as communication. So please welcome Peter Godfrey.
Thanks. Okay, so as the title suggests, I think that one way to think about memory in general is to see it as communication. Communication between stages, or perhaps between an earlier and a later self. Now, I think this is clearly a possible way of thinking about memory, and some forms of memory make the link very clear, such as diaries and reminder notes. It's a different matter, though, to apply a communicative model to internal psychological memory, to what's normally referred to as storage of information in the brain. In that case, it might seem that memory can be metaphorically described as communication, but purely as a metaphor. I think some other people in cognitive science might say that memory does have a superficial relationship to communication because both memory and communication are cases of information transmission, where that's the theoretically important category. Information transmission is at the bottom of both phenomena. Now, if that was true, then there would be nothing to gain from looking at memory from the point of view of communication, because the distinctive features of communication would not carry over to memory. This paper, though, applies a communicative model to memory understood in a broad way, as a broad functional category, including neural/psychological memory. I would also apply these ideas to genetic and epigenetic forms of memory. I won't talk about that today. And artifactual memory systems existing in social spaces. So the idea is to make that connection more than a loose analogy and to make it something that actually helps us understand memory, including memory in its familiar psychological forms. Now, that's only possible if there's some theory of communication that can add something to what we already know about memory. So it has to be a theory that's general enough to cover all those cases, but rich enough to say something unobvious. And the point of the paper is that a family of recent models of communication, which were developed for quite different reasons, can indeed play a role of that kind. So what I'll do is I'll first talk about the models of communication, then apply them in a general, fairly philosophical way to the case of communication over time, and then look at the end at a little bit of recent psychological work. Okay, the ideas about communication I'll be discussing begin in a simple model developed by David Lewis, published in 1969. The model was generalized by Brian Skirms in 1996 and has since been developed further by various other people. So Lewis wanted to understand simple forms of conventional communication. And he said, imagine two agents, a sender who can see the state of the world but who cannot act except to produce signals of some kind, and a receiver who can see only the signs made by the sender but who can act in a way that has consequences for both sides. Each agent adjusts their behaviors independently, guided by their preferences about the pairings of actions on the part of the receiver with states of the world, where those pairings will then be due to choices made on both sides. So here's a diagram. This is my diagram, not Lewis's, and my terminology also differs from Lewis's. But more precisely, the role of the sender is to implement a sender's rule, F sub S, a mapping from states of the world that they perceive to messages. The receiver implements a receiver's rule, F sub R, mapping messages to acts. And when the two are composed, there's a mapping F from states of the world to actions. Now, each pairing of an action and a state of the world generates a payoff for each agent, where those payoffs might be the same for the two agents or not the same. So the The diagram here, I think, pictures the essentials. Lewis himself assumed common interest between the two agents and common knowledge. So he assumed that the agents have the same preferences for which acts they want produced in each state of the world, and each agent knows this and knows that the other knows this, and so on. The two agents choosing rationally, given their common knowledge, may then be able to reach an equilibrium state where the sender sends distinctive messages in each state of the world and the receiver uses these as a guide to behaviour. So Lewis used the example of Paul Revere in the American Revolution. Suppose that the sexton of the Old North Church in Boston has a rule: put out one lantern if the invasion is coming by land, 2 lanterns if the invasion is coming by sea. And suppose Paul Revere has a rule: if you see 1 lantern, prepare the defences for a land invasion. If you see 2 lanterns, prepare the defences for a sea invasion. Then both sides can achieve what they want. Any statistical association, any predictability relationship between signs and states of the world, the kind of thing that might be measured with, for example, the mutual information between those 2 variables, any association of that kind is due directly to the sender's behaviours, to the sender's rule. The sender puts information into signs if there is information in the signs. But the value of any such rule to the sender will be affected, obviously, by the receiver's rule, which is being shaped by the receiver's own agenda. So the Lewis model treats coevolution in a broad sense of those 2 rules, the sender's rule and the receiver's rule. The sender's rule is shaped by the interpretation waiting, or apparently waiting, downstream. The receiver's rule is affected by how the sender is or appears to be sending. Brian Skirms, from the mid-90s, generalised and naturalised the Lewis model. So Skirms first replaced rational choice with natural selection and showed that signalling of the Lewisian kind can evolve as well as be chosen, including in quite simple organisms. Skirms then generalised the model to various other selection processes that might shape the sender's and the receiver's rule, including reinforcement learning and imitation of successful actions in a population. So there's a family of selection processes which differ a lot in details, but which can all generate signalling of roughly the Lewisian kind. That's the upshot of Lewis's work and Skirms' generalisation in the 90s and more recently. Signalling can be shaped by several of these selection processes working at once at different timescales. They're all processes in which sender and receiver behaviours can co-evolve or be mutually shaped, if you want a less biological sounding term. They're all situations in which the consequences of sign use by a receiver, on the right-hand side, feedback and affect choices about sign production by a sender. Now, sometimes these will be the actual consequences of behaviours on the receiver's part, as reflected in actual payoffs. Sometimes, as in the original Lewis model, they'll be merely envisaged payoffs, where the sender has beliefs about what the receiver is likely to do, and so on. Now, sometimes those distinctions matter very much, but not always, and we can offer some generalizations. The point of the model, understood generally, is to think about signs, symbols, representations in a particular way, in terms of the interlocking behaviours on each side of a sign, the rules of sign making and sign use, or the rules of sign production and sign consumption, the rules of sending and of receiving. Those behaviours, those pairs of behaviours, are explained in terms of the consequences of pairing actions with states of the world, as those pairings figure in some process of selection, either rational or more mechanical. Okay, next I'll look at the role of common interest between the 2 sides. Lewis analysed signalling in situations in which, as he put it, common interest predominates. Skirms began looking at conflicts and mixtures, and economists and biologists have for some time been thinking about information exchange in situations with imperfectly aligned interests. So a kind of intuitive picture by means of that work and a sort of informal line of argument might go like this. With complete common interest between sender and receiver, and selection of rules based on payoffs, informative signalling will clearly be a stable situation. Complete common interest we can take to mean this, that the sender and receiver have the same preference ordering over actions in every state of the world. However the world might be, the sender and receiver want the same actions performed. Consider the other extreme, where sender and receiver have reversed preference orderings over actions in every state of the world. Then it might seem that any sensitivity on either side will be exploited by the other. There's no point in talking when anything you say can be used against you, and no point in listening when the sender is trying to get you to do things you don't want to do. So then it would seem that communication should cease. And then between those two extremes, there are many different degrees of partial common interest. In the last few years, Manolo Martinez and I have done a systematic investigation of these relationships, looking especially at the intermediate cases. So we developed a measure of common interest and did a computer search of hundreds of thousands of games with 3 possible states of the world, roughly the Lewis type scenario as above, 3 possible actions and so on, and all different relationships between payoffs. Where the point of the work is to ask, what is the relationship between degrees of common interest and the possibility of stable informative signaling? So our measure of common interest C is a measure of how similar the preferences of sender and receiver are in various states of the world. I can talk about this more in question time if people would like. We scale this between 0 and 1, where 0 is complete conflict of interest. You always want different actions done. 1 is complete common interest. You always want the same actions done, and so on. And we found that if you sample a large number of games of different degrees of common interest, we find that if you chart the proportion of games of a given degree of common interest that allow stable communication as a function of common interest, you get a graph like that. So there's a fairly systematic relationship between common interest and signaling in a Lewis-type model, but with some surprises. It's not obvious from the chart, but a tiny fraction of games with completely reversed preferences in every state across sender and receiver do allow stable signaling. I can discuss all this in question time if people would like, but it won't be especially important today. The basic point at this stage is that common interest does indeed help communication be stable, with some quirks and some surprises. Next, here I'm still just discussing the model itself. I'll discuss a point that involves a criticism of models of this general kind. This criticism is especially due to Dan Sperber and Deirdre Wilson. Here's a quote from Sperber and Wilson's classic book, Relevance, from the 80s. Sperber and Wilson are interested in human communication, and what they wanted to do is oppose what they call the code model of human communication. According to the code model, speakers put meaning into a sign, piece of language or whatever, and hearers get it out by decoding, by doing a kind of inverse operation. Any particular content is either in the message or not in the message. The sender puts content in by means of some convention, and the receiver decodes. But, Sperber and Wilson say, a great deal of human communication does not fit this model because it's improvised on the fly, where the sender makes use of the receiver's ability to make inferences, and the role of the sender is not to provide a coded message, but to provide evidence to a smart receiver of what the sender is trying to get across. So I won't read out all of the text. There's an example there. Mary and Peter sitting on a park bench. He leans back, altering her view. As a result of his leaning back, she sees various things, including an unwanted approach by the dreaded, boring William, and is thereby able to infer various things both about what Peter was trying to get across and learn various things about the state of the world. This, Sperber and Wilson regard as an extreme case of something which is seen routinely in ordinary language use as well. Rather than encoding a content into a message, the role of a sender is to make use of the receiver's capacity to work out what the sender is trying to get across. The sender or speaker provides evidence to the hearer, not an encoded message. According to what they call the inferential model, which they oppose to the code model, communication works in human beings by means of speakers producing signs that change the epistemic environment of hearers or receivers in a way that gives them evidence, especially evidence of what the speaker is trying to convey. Now, Sperber and Wilson don't say that the code model is completely wrong, but they think that theories of communication have paid insufficient attention to the ability of intelligent human agents to communicate by providing cues in this way, in a flexible and ad hoc manner. Sperber thinks that a Lewis model type view like mine is on the bad side of the code/inference model distinction. I don't think it is, or rather I don't think it's on the bad side of what I see as the defensible distinction in this area. I see this sort of work here as part of the right way to develop a sender-receiver model. The phenomena that Sperber and Wilson are evoking here are one kind of sender-receiver interaction, in which flexibility on both sides is relevant, but the basic Lewisian coordination of behaviours is still in place. The sender can produce novel signs in a way geared towards the inferential abilities of a receiver, and the receiver can interpret the sender's output in whatever way suits their interests and situation. Any effect that a sender can have on a receiver's environment can be used in principle as a signal. This improvisation and compression by the sender relies, however, on smartness on the receiver's side. You can't do what Sperber and Wilson are describing if Peter and Mary are bacteria or if they are ants. When the receiver is less smart, the sender has to use a more standardized system. Otherwise, the beneficial effects of communication have no way of being systematically produced. That's the truth in what Sperber and Wilson called the code model. But when the sender and receiver are smarter, the advantages of communicative interaction don't depend on so much standardization. Then there can be systematic benefits without standardized sign production and use, with more flexibility and opportunism. Okay, a few more thoughts before moving on. The Lewis model is, of course, a model. It needs a commentary to be applicable to any empirical system. I think it applies to lots of systems, but often in a partial way. Now, there's a philosophy of science point to make here. This is a piece of model-based theorizing about a complex phenomenon, so it involves idealization. There's also a point to make that is more a philosophy of language, but also a philosophy of science point as well. There will often be a temptation to describe partial cases or imperfect cases of a sender-receiver system using language that only really applies to the clearer and more paradigm cases, and that can be an important source of confusion. There's also an evolutionary point to make. If sender-receiver systems come in clearer and more marginal forms, we can ask which factors in an evolving system will push a system more towards one state or the other, towards being a clear send-receive system with a distinct sender, message, and receiver, as opposed to something different. For example, a structure where there's not a clear separation between some of these things that the model treats as distinct. There can be a kind of entanglement, in particular, between message and receiver or interpreter. Okay, so we have this good model of communication, and let's now discuss briefly different ways in which it can be applied. As I see it, there are three main dimensions of generality worth distinguishing here. Firstly, different selection processes operating on different timescales. Signaling can evolve, it can be rationally chosen, it can be learned. These are all different selection processes that can result in a roughly similar outcome. Secondly, there can be signaling both within and between agents. The sender and receiver can be within the confines of a single organism, or they can be two different organisms. Thirdly, signaling of this kind can bridge both space and time. Earlier stages of a system can have access to information that's useful in guiding information of later stages. There can be a temporal bridging as well as a spatial bridging. This fits the Lewis model just as well as cases, the more obvious cases, where the gap to be bridged involves space. And from here, I hope it's apparent that the within organism application of the model, where the separation of sender and receiver is temporal rather than spatial, is the case of memory. So now we'll start talking about time and memory. So again, here's the basic application of the model to memory. Memory is communication over time, communication between stages of a single organism or of some other relevant entity such as a social group. A human being can be divided either into parts, arms and legs, or stages, you today, you tomorrow. Now, strictly speaking, of course, the parts also have stages, your leg today, your leg tomorrow, but here I'll be focusing on just on one division at a time, either a part-based division or a stage-based division. Now, the idea of a communicative model of memory is not dependent on a treatment of stages as agents in a strong everyday sense with their own separate agendas. That's one available version of the view, which I'll talk about, but the basic idea is less contentious. We saw earlier that the Lewis model can be applied to quite simple senders and receivers. It's familiar, I think, to talk about communication or signaling between parts of an organism, spatial parts. Sometimes this talk is probably richer than it should be. There's often a temptation to describe partial cases of a send-receive system in language that only really applies to the paradigm-clearer cases. But in principle, the idea is okay, and lots of it conforms, at least approximately, to the Lewis model. So consider the division between the sensory and the motor parts of a simple organism. The sensory parts have access to information about the environment, and the motor parts can act. The figure I gave earlier, which was initially a figure of a kind of Sexton and Revere type between agent configuration, can also be seen as a representation of the kind of basic schematic features of the design of a simple organism, with sensors on the left and effectors or motor parts on the right. The Lewis model can now also be applied to stages as well as parts. Earlier stages of an organism often have access to information that's relevant to action at a later time. So the earlier stage might leave a mark or a trace that can be utilized to guide later actions, and that also fits the Lewis model, at least roughly. Beyond the initial similarity, there are, of course, differences. In the case of stages, the later stage of you is a material continuation of the earlier stage. The earlier stage grows or develops into the latter, and the earlier is eliminated by this very process. Often, of course, talk of stages is rather misleading because there's no natural boundary between one stage and another, except in special cases such as organisms that have a metamorphosis step. That's not itself a problem for the sender-receiver model, however. A write-read process is a send-receive process in the relevant sense. Suppose you write yourself a reminder note and come back and read it later. The stages, sender and receiver, are only marked off as separate by those very acts of writing and reading, but that isn't a problem for the application of the Lewis model. As always, there's a rule of production or a policy of production and one of interpretation. Over any appreciable temporal gap, the sender cannot determine the rule of interpretation. That's up to the receiver who exists at a later time. Again, in the case of stages, earlier ones develop into and give rise to later ones. In the case of parts, that's not so. In the case of organisms like us, though, the spatially separate parts are produced from a single source through a developmental sequence that shapes many parts. Parts present at a time, your arms and legs, are related as products of a common cause rather than links in a chain, as in the case of stages. This is qualified when individual genes present at the start of life have their own special causal responsibility for particular parts of the organism. Then it can be that distinct parts at an earlier time are responsible for distinct parts at a later time. But to the extent that parts of an organism are produced in a holistic way by all the material present early on, there's a similarity between parts and stages with respect to an evolutionary embedding of a sender-receiver model. Okay, now let's take a look at interests and the relations between interests in the case of parts and stages. In the sender-receiver model itself, as we saw, an important role is played by relations between interests of sender and receiver. There's more communication when the interests converge. How does this relate to parts and especially also to stages? Let me first note that what's in general important here is not a folk theoretic, an everyday conception of interests. All talk of converging and diverging interests in a sender-receiver model situation is a shorthand for properties that matter in whatever selection process is relevant in that application of the model. So in the case of an evolutionary embedding of the model, talk of interests is very much a shorthand. When we say that as a preference order the sender has over actions, this is a shorthand for the ordering of actions with respect to how they contribute to reproductive success in that state of the world. Talk of interests works differently as a shorthand in the context of some other selection processes, and in the case of deliberate choice, talk of interests is then, of course, literally understood. Let's start with evolutionary interests of the kind linked to reproduction and Darwinian processes. In the within-organism cases, initially it may seem that breakdown of common interest is not possible. The eyes don't have a definite set of interests that may or may not align with those of the legs. They're parts of a single entity whose parts collaborate in giving rise to various behaviours of the whole. You might even say this is a situation where talk of common interest is misleading and really there's just joint interests between the parts of an organism. Conflict of interests in an evolutionary sense can occur between parts of an organism, however. In organisms without a separation between germ and soma cells, such as plants, it's entirely possible for one part to compete with another part. One branch of a tree can compete with another branch of a tree in a reproductive way. Each branch of a tree is the seat of its own reproductive capacities, and a mutation on one branch can lead to that branch outcompeting others. In organisms like ourselves, with a set of germ cells set aside early that are relevant to reproduction, it's not so common, but not impossible, and perhaps even not rare. My former colleague David Haig's work is probably the main current research program looking at divergent interests between parts of a single organism in the case of humans. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but the core idea is that the maternally derived genes within a mammal, such as a human, can have different interests from the paternally derived genes within the same organism, especially with respect to the allocation of resources to the individual carrying those genes as opposed to their siblings. So it's possible, but rather special, to have divergent evolutionary interests between parts. Let's now look at stages. Can the evolutionary interests of stages of one organism diverge? I think the answer is no, or at least not outside very unusual, perhaps always fictional cases. Reproduction, biological reproduction, is the act of a temporally extended living thing which must develop in order to reproduce. Stages cooperate in development to produce the sexually mature state, and it's very difficult for stages to genuinely compete or to have, in an evolutionarily relevant sense, different reproductive interests. What would be required, or I guess the most natural way for it to happen, would be for earlier stages to belong to different heritable types, to have perhaps different genotypes from later stages in a way that enabled ecological competition between the two genotypes. And that would be, I take that to be a sort of something that never exists in fact and perhaps requires fairly unrealistic hypothetical assumptions. So I think competition between stages in an evolutionary context is either not possible or not possible in some reasonable empirical sense. Okay, now back to memory and more generally communication over time. In the case of memory, a variety of selection processes and hence a variety of senses of the word interest are relevant, where the selection processes work at different scales. But we have at least the following. We've got a basic psychological architecture shaped by evolution, which does various things, including many things not under voluntary control. And secondly, we have behaviours, including memory-related behaviours, due to decisions that a person makes based on ordinary preferences, including conscious preferences. There are probably more things relevant as well, but I will stick to these two. Now, if those are the two selection processes shaping memory, then I think via the arguments above, to the extent that memory systems are shaped by evolution, divergence of interest is not possible in realistic circumstances. Now let's look at choices based on preferences. Here, divergence of interests among temporal stages is at least unproblematic in principle. The crucial difference from the evolutionary case is that the fact that the psychological profile an agent has at a time is sufficient to generate preferences and guide actions. So the psychological profile an agent has at a time is not merely part of a larger temporally extended entity needed to express a choice. In contrast, a developmental stage of an organism at a time is merely part of a larger temporally extended entity that engages in biological reproduction. So stages are much psychologically richer entities than parts. It's then an open empirical question how much agreement there is between stages in what they want. How much is there? Well, quite a lot, certainly. Evolution shapes our patterns of desiring, and this shaping includes constraints on relationships between desires we have at different times. But the agreement between stages with respect to preferences is a contingent matter and very much a partial one, where the obvious forms of divergence include changes in values, especially of a kind that might be predicted at the sender stage. So a kind of a cartoon or very simple version of that kind of change in values is seen in the case of Ulysses and the Sirens type phenomena, where early Ulysses can anticipate distortions of rational faculties that will lead to different preferences at a later time and might do things to thwart the actions of his later self. Secondly, and more subtly, there can be a reversal of preferences without a change in underlying valuations due to temporal discounting of goods. Now, there's nothing irrational about discounting future goods, about preferring $10 now to $10 a year from now. There's nothing irrational about discounting future goods, but the mode of discounting can be either rational or irrational, and there's a large literature on this in behavioral economics. This I won't do for this talk. That would add too much material, but that's a second important category where there can be divergence of preferences across temporal stages within a single lifetime. So the larger point is that parts and stages, or temporal and spatial divides, are flip sides here. In the case of evolutionary interests, divergence between parts is empirically possible. Divergence of interest between stages, I take it, is not practically possible. With respect to preferences, divergence of preferences between stages is common. Can there be divergence of preferences between parts of a single organism? Maybe it's not straightforward at all, perhaps possible only in special cases, certainly perhaps in cases like split brain cases, but it requires that the individual parts of a single organism have a rich enough psychological profile to determine their own preferences, which can be at odds with the preferences of another stage. So in evolution, stages are bound together, but parts are not so much bound together. In the context of psychologically determined choices, in contrast, stages can have any degree of separation, and parts are usually bound together quite tightly. Okay, how might facts about intertemporal divergences of interests affect memory? Might an earlier stage control the flow of information to later stages in a way divided by divergence of interests? I take it there are sort of two categories to consider here. Omitting to send information from one stage to a later stage, or obliterating pre-existing traces, that's one category. And secondly, sending false or deceptive information from an earlier stage to a later stage. Now, the obliterating or omitting to send I take to be straightforward, very common, not at all a remarkable thing. One chooses what one writes down in diaries, might be more or less inclined to be fully explicit, especially about how badly or well an event went. As far as onboard memory goes, you can try to forget things to some extent. There's been some psychological work on this. Certainly you can try to remember some things and not others. And it's possible, of course, to drink in order to forget. Can you send deliberately false information? This, I take it, is not so easy. Given the way our psychological mechanisms work, it's hard to send your future self misinformation without believing it yourself in the meantime, which would defeat the purpose. When you create a memory trace at time 1, for use at a later time 2, it's present through the intervening period, and it's not apparently possible to sequester a memory trace, so it's not part of your belief system in the meantime. This is a context where the material continuity between sender and receiver that applies in the temporal case and not in the spatial case is quite important. To bring about normal use of a memory trace in the future without believing it now would require some kind of rupture between the temporal stages. Now, using external memory devices, to some extent, can circumvent the problem. When you use external memory rather than onboard memory, it's not the case that the trace is present and potentially active during all the intermediate times between sending and receiving. It can be stored in a way that makes it inert for a period of time. However, of course, your onboard capacities can still interfere. If you retain an onboard memory of why you stashed a note away at time 1, then at time 2 you won't believe your own note. And the same applies if you don't retain a memory of your motives at time 1, but are likely to make inferences which interfere with this conclusion. So deception of one stage by an earlier stage would require that you sequester the information, as in a note, and ensure that your other memory capacities don't undermine the project. And I take that to be quite demanding. It's not easy to deliberately send deceptive information in a way that makes it likely that it will be taken seriously by your later stage. And there's a genre of fiction that devotes much detail to making this sort of thing possible, as seen in movies such as Total Recall and Memento. So I think it would sometimes make quite a lot of sense for earlier stages to deceive later stages due to the predictable ways in which preferences can diverge between stages, if they could do so. But in the case of onboard memory especially, I take this to be very difficult to achieve. Okay, that part of the talk was a rather general discussion of signalling between stages and signalling between parts. The last part of the talk will be more concrete, and I'll talk about the functions of memory in humans. Now, there's lots we could talk about here. There are many kinds of memory in our minds and elsewhere, but I think I'll go straight to the most vividly familiar and contentious form of memory in humans, which is autobiographical human memory, or what's often called episodic memory. This is the kind of memory where you remember experiences rather than facts and rather than skills, and the kind of memory where you sort of appear to relive an earlier experience. Episodic memory has two notable features. Firstly, it's focused on particularities, particular experiences, and secondly, it has a strong phenomenology and strong engagement with our emotions. This is an area where in the last couple of decades there's been a number of unusual and interesting hypotheses and ideas arising about both the nature and the function of episodic memory, where the emphasis of much of the work has been on the role of reconstruction rather than reproduction in episodic memory, and that has been linked to unobvious views about what the function of episodic memory is, what it's for. I take it that the default view of the function of all kinds of memory is that what we're doing is engaging in some kind of fact tracking. We're trying to remember across time facts or skills that will be useful later on. For episodic memory, many people think this is not so clear. So here's an argument, a simple argument given by Pascal Boyer. So Boyer says, if the point of memory is to store information useful for future action, you would certainly expect there to be semantic and procedural memory. But the whole point of episodic memory is that it's focused on the particular, not on patterns, and it's patterns, generalities, that are useful for controlling behavior, not unique particular events. So Boyer says, it's not clear why organisms should have episodic memory. If anything, it would seem that organisms learn about the past mostly to the extent that they can extract from past situations what is not unique to them, the general features of past situations, and hence what will be relevant in the future. For Boyer, it seems sort of informationally self-defeating to retain all these particularities rather than doing an extraction of the general features that are useful for future action. So that's one argument, raising questions about the function of episodic memory. Further, we have a tendency to cook up episodic memories in a way influenced by the context of remembering and also influenced by previous events of recall between the present and the target event that we're trying to remember. There's a great deal of creativity of recall in episodic memory, and that suggests to many people that there's more going on than mere information storage. Now, this idea goes back to Francis Barrett in the 1930s, and in recent decades there's been a number of interesting ideas developed along these lines. In particular, Ann Wilson and Michael Ross, about 10 years ago, wrote about what they called the identity function of autobiographical memory. They argue that people's constructions of themselves through time serve the function of creating a coherent and largely favourable view of their present selves and circumstances. So we're engaged in a kind of building up of ourselves in specifically episodic memory, memory of experiences. That's compatible with the Boyer view, where you might say, for the purpose of practical guidance of action, we use semantic memory, and episodic memory, the colourful kind of memory, has this identity-forming view rather than what appears to be its obvious function. More recently, Corbalis and Sudendorf and Schachter and Addis have offered a more contentious idea in the same family, which they call the future first hypothesis. The idea here starts from the fact that similar neural mechanisms appear to be used for both remembering past events and imagining future events for purposes of planning. And it may be that the latter of these roles is primary, and where the strong version of that idea is the idea that the way the mechanisms work, the way the mechanisms of episodic memory work, is explained mostly by their planning role, not by any genuine memory role. So I've put on the slide there a couple of the relevant articles, and here's a quote from Sudendorf and Corbalis. This one I guess I will read out. They say, "The fact that episodic memory is fragmentary and fragile suggests that its adaptiveness may derive less from its role as an accurate record of personal history than from providing a vocabulary from which to construct planned events." And perhaps, and this is, I take it, a nod to Wilson and Ross, perhaps to embellish events of the past. So it may be that it may be part of a more general toolbox that allowed us to escape the present and develop foresight. Indeed, our ability to revisit the past may be only a design feature, a kind of byproduct of our ability to conceive the future. Well, how do those ideas look within a communicative model of memory? Firstly, all these discussions about episodic memory, including Ross and Wilson, Schachter and Addis, Sudendorf and Corbalis, they're all very much centred on the recall side, on the acts of reminiscence or readout. So creativity on the recall side, especially of a kind that leads to factual error, is taken to suggest a revision of our views about memory's functions. As the communicative model emphasises, though, it takes two to tango. And whatever is being done by the later stage is being done in a way influenced by the making of marks by the earlier stage. So the earlier stage is at least complicit or at least involved. So if there's creative imagining going on at the later time, this is conspiratorial with the earlier stage. Marks are being made that facilitate creative imagining of a particular kind. To the extent that this is due to the evolved architecture, a temporally extended set of dispositions is what evolves. Dispositions to do this now and do this later. Now, it is possible, though, that some of this is happening in a way that's outside the normal operation of the evolved architecture, and then there's no need to assume common interest. Then there might be divergence of interests. Secondly, how much antagonism is there between a fact-tracking role, the obvious-looking view of the function of memory, and some degree of creative cooking up of memories? Well, in response to this question, we should remember the example of communication that I quoted earlier from Sperber and Wilson, the improvised gesture designed to economically convey to Mary the approach of the dreaded William. Now this was a piece of communication that had the role of conveying a fact. Given the presence of a smart receiver, the sender could do something novel and subtle and get a fact across in a way that relies on the creativity, in a sense, of the agent on the receiver side. Now in this case, I think we can see two possible roles for the unusual communicative choice. There's considerations of economy and a kind of social function. There's a kind of oiling of the wheels of the relationship by means of the gesture, or perhaps attempting to impress. Those do not compromise a fact-tracking role here. They are further functions. Links, we can now look at some links back from a case like this to cases of memory. A first bridge might be made to external memory based on improvised cues, where people leave things in odd places to remind themselves that something has to be remembered or done. Or here's another case. I take notes in the sun often with an old laptop computer whose screen cannot compete with the sun, so I type away, and literally every third letter is a typo. But I can easily reconstruct what I meant to write down later. It's obvious to me, my later self, what I meant to be getting across in the earlier self, despite the fact that there's no code present, or at least the code has been so thoroughly degraded. So there's no antagonism between a fact-tracking function and a kind of creativity with respect to the actions of the receiver. Could that apply also in the case of onboard psychological memory? Now, I don't know. I think that's essentially an empirical matter, but it is a possibility. The secondary role, I take it then, would not be, as it was in the case of Sperber and Wilson, oiling the wheels of a relationship or economy, but perhaps maintaining a coherent character. Something along the lines of the Wilson and Ross hypothesis about episodic memory. Perhaps then there is more conflict, some conflict with the goal of factual accuracy, more than there is in the case of person-to-person communication exhibited by Sperber and Wilson. So we can see the possibility here of a kind of mixed adaptive explanation for some of the peculiarities of episodic memory. Accurate signaling between stages is one thing that organisms like ourselves benefit from, but we also benefit from imposing a coherent story on our lives, even where this involves some compromising of accuracy. And further, as I emphasized, this is not purely a receiver-based behavior. The traces left by our earlier selves, the senders, would be designed for this use, as well as designed for accurate reconstruction. I'll wrap up shortly. I'll do two more things. I'll make one brief point about the earlier argument about episodic memory that was due to Pascal Boyer, and then I'll go on and draw a few conclusions. Remember the Boyer argument that said the point of the fact-tracking side of memory is to learn generalities, not particularities. So the function of episodic memory is unobvious. In response to this, I wanted to mention an interesting point made in a talk I heard recently by the psychologist Nathaniel Dorr. Dorr works on the role of episodic memory in low-level tasks, such as bandit tasks, where you're trying to choose which of two gambling-type devices to play in order to receive a payoff. And Dorr compared a standard view of how choice works on bandit tasks. So there's essentially two poker machines, and you try both and try to work out which one pays off more and stick to then the one that pays off more. The standard view of choice on bandit tasks is that people keep a running average weighted by recency of how much each of the possible sources of payoff has in fact paid off. The alternative view is that you base your decision not on a running average, but on one case, sampled in a way weighted by how recent it is, and you let that one case of either success or failure guide what you do. They make similar predictions with respect to what you'll do on average, but not with respect to how individuals will vary. And with respect to the pattern of variation, the idea that you base decisions on one remembered case fit the data better. This seems surprising. You would think that a running average would be a more useful thing. But here Dorr made, I think, what is a rather astute ecological comment. Dorr said, in real ecology, you're never doing the same task 300 times in a row in the same circumstances. The cases all vary. The idea of a genuinely repeated task, identical across trials, is an artifact of experiments, not something seen in real life. So he suggests the running average view was always somewhat dubious. And in that situation, where there's a genuine role for uniqueness of instances, it makes more sense to draw on the most relevantly similar recent instance. So I think of that as quite a good response to the Boyer argument that the role that episodic memory has for the particular is at tension with the idea that the point of episodic memory is to track useful facts, to store information useful to future behaviour. So with respect to episodic memory and other kinds of smart human memory, if I had to bet, I would bet more on a function involving the tracking of facts than is now often admitted, plus a good dose of the Wilson and Ross identity function, the idea of shaping our character by means of massaging our memory of the past. So fact tracking with ancillary roles. That's what I would bet on, even though when I say that, there's a great deal of hunch in that. I don't have data that would push in this particular direction. Okay, a couple of points now just to conclude. So, memory as communication. Is this a good way of thinking about memory? I think the idea is applicable in a broad way. Perhaps it's only genuinely useful in a narrower class of cases. Certainly it's useful when memory involves the overt technology of communication, such as language and written records, but I'm suggesting it's useful in a broader class of cases than that, including a variety of cases where the utility of a communicative model is unobvious. There are cases where the bridging of time is communication-like in subtle ways that standard talk of information transmission or storage does not, I think, capture. That's especially true in the case of memory phenomena where there is some smartness and freedom of movement on the receiver side, and hence where the sender side must be adapted to the presence of that kind of receiver at the later time. Now, episodic memory, I think, seems to be like this. It doesn't feel like this. It doesn't feel like the interpretation of a trace that was left by a sender in anticipation of smart interpretive moves by a later receiver. Instead, episodic memory feels like something where the past is just there again. But if you think about it, it is like that. It is the interpretation by a later stage of a trace left by an earlier stage with behaviours on each side that have evolved to relate to each other in specific ways. I think in ways that have been very much illuminated by the development of the Lewis model and its relatives. Thanks.
So we have plenty of time for questions.
Recently, in some of the evolutionary psychology literature, people have been discussing the role of communication in the kind of evolution of morality. And I was wondering if you think that some kind of, I'm wondering if you can incorporate moral considerations into this model. For instance, we all have memories where we look back and we are filled with like shame or pleasure that something happened. And do you think that these affective states can be part of some kind of communication? Or can we kind of make sense of morality in that way using our memories?
I don't know. I'll just mention one other piece of the Pascal Boyer work that I drew on, which I think of as quite interesting. I think it's important to mention this up against the Wilson and Ross view of memory in which we shape memories to make ourselves look better. Boyer says, look, it's not really true that we tend to obsessively remember the things that went well for us. We often ruminate on our failures and errors and do so in a way that magnifies situations in our past where there was some preventable error, where we did something that turned out badly and could have behaved differently. In the context of a communicative model, you can see that as a situation where earlier stages are trying to constrain later stages by sending a message that amplifies the vividness and salience of regret, essentially. So Boyer says that The work I didn't discuss in detail by Ainsley about intertemporal bargaining is also relevant here, but I think on the fly I would not do a job of making the link in detail, so I'll just mention that as another possible connection.
So I was wondering, is there any work on confirmation bias with regard to memory as communication? Because it seems like you use that as the anti-employer thing, because it seems like it is a case where you somehow misrepresent the past, at least. Because of, so, like, you use episodic memory. I don't know if it is episodic memory, I don't know. But it seems like you're remembering some episodes over others in order to sort of have certain beliefs later.
That's interesting. I would think that ordinary confirmation bias needn't involve anything it needn't be a memory-based phenomenon, but it could be in some cases.
That one time where I saw a red car and that happened, right, is something that will trigger, well, in the future, every time I see a red car, then I'm going to think.
So Nathaniel Dorr in the talk I talked about briefly, I mean, this is a tension with what he's saying. So Dorr is saying what might look to you as if a tendency to just sort of remember these one isolated cases and base action upon them might not look like a very smart thing to do, because surely it makes more sense to generalize and keep proper statistics about the average tendencies in cases of a certain kind. And Dorr said, well, maybe not. I mean, if it's really true that there are 300 cases that are all the same, then an average is a useful thing. But if much of your life consists of unrepeatable, unique episodes, then you can't do much better, he thinks, than just basing your action on what conspicuously worked or didn't work in the most relevantly similar individual instance. That was his somewhat unorthodox comment about learning from experience. That could be true. And then there will be a further question about whether we do this well or badly. If we only remember the good cases and don't remember the bad cases, I take it that would involve a kind of confirmation bias and one that was unhelpful. So I agree that there might be an interesting connection there.
A related question about a possible way of thinking about the value of episodic memory. So I have two ideas. One was just that I think it's related to the idea that you never get 300 cases the same, but a little bit different. Goodman, or problems about what makes things the same. It might make sense that we, alongside our ongoingly updated assessment of what are the relevant kinds to average over and what are the averages over them, we also try to keep the data bank, the full record of the individual instances, so that we can check back. If we start to get new patterns that look consistent with the averages that we've been keeping, we can look back at the past record of the data and see that we were looking for the wrong pattern.
I agree. I agree very much with that. Right. I guess this complements his point. So, for example, you go to a party and you remember thousands of things that happened at the party. A lot of it just seems like pointless clutter to remember. But I think Dorr would say, well, you don't know what are the relevant patterns there now, the things that are, you don't know what's a good compression of the information. You have no good rules for compression now. A month from now, you might realize, oh my God, the important thing that happened there was X, not this thing I thought was the important message, Y. So that's a reason not to compress. It's a reason to hang on to the particularities of episodes.
That's right. And often it seems that we do exactly that, right? Just sort of phenomenologically. The other, well, maybe related thought was that then the presentation of those episodes as the main form of memory that we're kind of aware of might be just a way of making our current averages accessible or handleable, right? So that what individual episodes stand out, that there's symbols for patterns.
I think there my hunch would go in a different direction. So there are two features of episodic memory that are notable. One is it's focused on particularities, and the other is its phenomenological vividness. Now, this is now just a hunch exchange here, but I would think that the identity function side is what has the close tie to the phenomenological vividness. So once we have memory for particulars, this is a very useful tool with respect to the character forming or identity forming function that Ross and Wilson describe. And the way for it to be a useful tool is to make it phenomenologically powerful and tied in the ways that it is to the emotions. So I guess I'm suggesting that the phenomenological side of episodic memory perhaps doesn't have that connection to the anti-compression argument that we are both agreeing on.
Thank you. So I'm interested to, you mentioned that there were you made a number of really interesting distinctions, particularly between parts and stages with respect to memory and how communication could occur between them. And then you spoke about episodic memory particularly and listed several functions for which it may be used. Now, one of the things that I seem to remember from Tractor was that one of the hints about why he thought it was future reaching was because when he put people in scanners, the parts of their brain that seemed to consume more blood at certain points in time, when they were thinking about the future and when they were thinking about the past, were similar or very close to being the same parts of the brain. But if we think that what makes something count as episodic memory is the function that it's performing, and there's this variety of different functions, how is it that we get to group episodic memory as a single sort of target for the investigations and for the communicative roles that it's playing, if it can play multiple functional roles depending on which situation we find ourselves in? How do we get unified as a single target to try and explain?
I think those arguments from the brain imaging work are not strong arguments for the conclusion that was being offered. And I emphasize that the conclusion was offered as a somewhat speculative hypothesis, not as something that was supposed to be shown. But the fact that that similar parts of the brain are active in both planning and episodic recollection shows that something is doing double duty, perhaps. But it could be doing double duty with quite different roles in our lives. There could still be a genuine difference between using this tool for recollection and using it for planning. And the idea that there's an obvious priority to planning, I think of as I don't agree with arguments that there is such a priority. I think the situation looks a bit like this. People think that episodic memory is both, we cook things up, we manipulate it, and secondly, it has this focus on the particular, which people like Boyer think of as functionally a bit peculiar. And then it seems natural to suspect, at least, that some other function is primary, the function of planning rather than recollection. Now, I think the argument for the functional peculiarity of focusing on a particular is not a very strong argument. I think the good reason to remember the particular, just the exchange with Gillian was emphasizing. And I mean, it's possible that the future first hypothesis is true and that the planning function came first, but there's not I think, on the table good reasons to believe that at the present time. In response to the other part of what you were saying, if we ask how do we pick out the unit here, the object, episodic memory, I think the two features that I take to be fairly normally regarded as essential to it, it's phenomenologically vivid and it's focused on particulars. That's what I think of as a natural unit here for analysis.
So I'm thinking about this picture that you offered, operating on with respect to different levels of organization, right? So you can think of centers and receivers at the neural level. If you're bringing the epigenetic story in, then you've got molecular signaling cascades,
Right.
And that whole story. But the language that you use to describe it in terms of episodic memory, or memory at the level of the organism, is very intentional. And I'm wondering what happens to the story as you drive it down. You might be able to say something about that, because some people have said maybe it's useful to use intentional talk to talk about what's going on at different levels. But I'm wondering what happens to the story and how it's going to jive with what's going on.
It's a huge question, yeah, which I won't be able to, I think, do justice to. I'll say a couple of, yeah, I'll say a couple of things. So, part of what led me to this whole topic here is the fact that within the philosophy of biology and some parts of biology, people have been arguing about the role of genes and their informational properties in a way that has connections here. So, about 4 years ago, Carl Bergstrom and Martin Rosval and also Nicholas Shea wrote papers arguing that you should see genes as sort of, roughly speaking, messages sent across generations, messages sent from parents to offspring. So a sender-receiver picture of, a sender-receiver analysis of the functional role of genes, which vindicates the strongly informational treatment of genes. And I think I don't agree with that. You know, I think it's not really true that genes are messages sent across generations. And I won't go into those arguments here, but I've written things about each of the versions offered. But if they're not that, then what are they? And actually, I don't think I have the slide. I have a lovely quote from a biologist from the 1950s, David Nanny, where he says essentially, this is very early. This is a very early quote. It was before the genetic code had been uncovered, after DNA, but before the code had been worked out. He said, you really can think of cells as having two jobs to do and containing two means to doing them. There has to be a library, a kind of library-like repository of useful sequence information. And that's what DNA, he thought, is. It's a library-like structure. It's a memory-like structure. It's a memory molecule. And secondly, you have to have some way of working out which bits of a library get accessed at which times and places. And that's the role of epigenetic systems. Short-term marking of the DNA with methyl groups and the like is like it's the kind of memory involved in the control of access rather than the kind of memory involved in just keeping the books intact. So the idea of DNA as a memory-like, as playing a memory-like role, I think is quite a good idea. I think the error of those papers I mentioned, Shea and Bergstrom and Rosval, was to think that it fits the sender-receiver model in a very straightforward way, where there has to be a sender and a receiver. I think, roughly speaking, that genes are a cell-level memory with no sender. Evolution builds these things, and the reading step, the interpretation step, is pretty clear. You can see in the transcription and translation machinery a kind of reading or accessing of a library going on. But the message was not sent by anybody. It's just because of the unique place that DNA has within evolutionary processes, useful sequence information accumulates for cells to read. So genes are, roughly speaking, cell-level memory with no sender, no writer. And I think that explains both the naturalness and the awkwardness of informational descriptions of genes, because they sort of fit the model halfway. They're not representations of anything in the way that people sometimes suppose, but they have a library-like role nonetheless.
as a cognitive neuroscientist, I'm trying to still wrap my head around the idea that we bring in the concept of communication between states, between the past and the future state. And so, would you say that perhaps the biggest benefit in terms of understanding memory comes from the fact that we can then account for observations that it's not a precise description of our past, that it's dynamic, that the trace changes over time, and that also the past and the previous state have different goals? Would that sort of capture, one, the dynamic nature, that it is constantly changing, it's not just the preservation like a photograph, but two, that this is directly related, that your sense of self changes and the goals change, and which is comparable to what happens between two people communicating that the whole states are separate. Is that capturing the gist of?
I think that's a good statement of at least a large part of it. Let me just add a couple of things though. So, this is it's a philosophy talk in a foundational sort of place here, not talking so much about empirical details, talking about how to think about this in general. I take it that a lot of more conventional or familiar ways of talking about memory in psychology and cognitive neuroscience would use the notion of storage. You store it away and you come back and access it later. And this is taken to be either okay or at least not problematic as a way of thinking about what memory does. And I think of it as at least a little bit problematic. I don't think it's the best way to think about the essential function of memory. And this is partly why I went back twice to this quote from Sperber and Wilson. So communication is like this, right? It's not, or at least much communication in humans is like this, where what the sender does essentially is do something that alters the epistemic environment of the receiver, where that altering their environment need not be producing a persisting thing. It need not be a conventionalized symbolic medium that's used. It's perfectly normal in some cases for there to be endogenous change in the trace that was left. So for example, I might send you a message, but I might take a perfectly beautiful cake and put it in a box and send it in the mail to you, knowing that by the time it gets to you, it will have been smashed to bits, and you'll open it and you'll see a smashed cake. And that may be my way of conveying to you some amusing comment about the failure of our joint enterprise or something. Now, what I put in the box was a perfectly intact cake. I didn't put in a smashed cake, I put in an intact one, knowing that the natural processes by which it moved through time and space would tend to get it to you in a particular different state. And that can be an ordinary act of communication, where if you're thinking about this as using the language of storage or preservation, nothing has been stored or preserved. The cake got destroyed along the way. But the job of getting to the receiver a usable trace that they're able to make use of in a way that I intend is that function is served fine by means of something that changes endogenously in quite dramatic ways over the course of things. So what I'm trying to suggest, especially by leaning on this Sperber and Wilson quote, is that the normal ways of thinking about memory in terms of storage or even transmission, most of the time it's no big deal, but they're not quite the best way. They're not quite the best way to think about what memory does, especially because they lead to people supposing there's an antagonism between the creative or reconstructive side of memory and the tracking of facts. I think communication reminds us that the conveying of facts can be done in a way that relies on creative and reconstructive activity on the part of the receiver. So is this making it? I'm trying to emphasize the divergence between this way of thinking and the normal ways of thinking as well as I can.
That does help. And it reminds me a bit, in the neuroscience literature, people are trying to sometimes make the distinction between a memory trace and memory itself. And some people have argued there isn't something like memory unless you engage in what we would call the receiving function. What you have is perhaps a trace, but memory as an entity, as a phenomenological entity for sure, only arises at the moment a receiver picks it up. So it can perhaps, so storage may still give us a good way to think about how can this experience be preserved or some aspects of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this preservation is memory in and of itself.
I'm okay with that last point, although I want to say that there's more, I wouldn't want that to be a summary of what I regard as essential here.
I wonder if, so one of the virtues of the model is there are certain questions that it's going to be able to answer that other people have had difficulty with. And particularly focusing on Sperber and Wilson and relevance, do you see this communication model as offering some maybe better ways to think about how we avoid things like frame problems or Theaetetus, you know, you walk into the aviary and you call the bird, but if you know what bird to call, you've already solved the problem. So what is it? How are you calling out the relevant, the right memories and so on? So the way that I'm imagining is that it's something really more in the spirit of Sperber and Wilson. It's not really a particular code that you have to get to match up, but you're giving something kind of in the ballpark that's going to allow for these possible inferences.
I don't know. I mean, there's some connection here. There's some connection between this set of ideas and the exchange with Gillian earlier, where keeping all the particularities of experience in the way episodic memory does is great if you're not very good at knowing at the time what's the best compression, what's the best generalization. So keep everything, and you can come back and find details that were important, it turns out, that you didn't realize were important at the time. The relationship between that and the frame problem.
What's the finding part? That's
I mean, you might say, I'm not sure. A person might say that the point of this compression that we do when we extract from experience semantic memories is to avoid what would be a nightmarish frame problem were we to encounter it routinely when trying to work out how to act in the light of previous experiences. We do the compression, extract a rule, and then when the time comes to act, we haven't got to then find out what's relevant because we've done the processing. We've picked predicates and expressed something using those predicates. A person might say that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that would be an important connection or not. I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure about that.
This is kind of following up a bit on several of the most recent questions, but the thing that struck me as problematic about the communication model you sketched at the beginning in application to memory is the presence of an agent sort of making choices about the sending rule or the storage to make and so on. Whereas with most cases in which memories get stored, even in advanced creatures like us, there's no conscious choice about the way it's laid down or what to emphasize, what to draw out, or anything like that. It's just a kind of a set mechanism that does or doesn't do things, and in that sense, it's lacking one of the interesting pieces of the whole negotiation model.
I think this is partly why the Skirm's generalization of Lewis was so important. So in the Lewis discussions, you've got this very intellectualized picture of what's going on. And that appeared to be essential. It appeared to be the heart of the model. You couldn't do anything without it. Skirms in 1996 tried to make the model as de-intellectualized as he possibly could, and succeeded, I think, in describing something that applies to bacteria just as much as it applies to more intelligent organisms. So all the sender has to do is implement a mapping from states to messages, and all the receiver has to do is implement another mapping. And lots of rather simple pieces of machinery could do that. And then the question is, how do you shape those pieces of machinery in a way that generates a good rather than a bad mapping? And that's where the evolutionary stuff becomes important. You evolve machinery that implements a useful rather than an unuseful mapping. one thing I like about this literature is the fact that Lewis did it for the most rational, intellectualized scenario possible. Skirms helpfully staked out the other extreme, described a purely mechanical way in which Lewisian signaling could arise. And in between there's all sorts of stuff that is smarter than what bacteria can do, but not as smart as what Lewis's agents can do. And I take it that much of what happens in our brains is in between in that kind of way. We can do things that no bacterium could do, but things which are truly subpersonal and don't involve whole agent psychological profiles. So, I mean, this part of the talk was, there could have been an hour in there of how the other kinds of selection processes and their mechanistic demands relate to the model, but that, of course, would have been a lot of detail in this context. So in some ways, I suppose I'm replying by saying that one of the things that the literature, I think, has successfully done is chart the relationships between very intelligent realizations of the Lewis setup and very unintelligent ones, and looked at how it is that the simplicity in the cognitive machinery must be compensated by complexity in the population level shaping processes. So this is not, as in some ways, a completely direct answer to your question, but I'm saying I don't think there's a big problem here with that side of the model.
So I've already asked a question. This is a little bit obscure and entirely selfish, but when you're talking about cutting up the system into parts, it is obvious what a unit is, because a unit is a part. I'm wondering if there are sort of good conventions when you're talking about memory for how to cut up stages into units. So obviously, if like t, if you do it in terms of time, t is like point blah 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 of a second, probably not very good. T being 8 million years is probably not very good, and something in between is probably right. Is there any sort of systematic way to do people do that in any sort of systematic way?
Let me first say something about the case of parts. So I think parts are this will enable a connection to a different part of the empirical and or at least the scientific literature. So if I don't have that quote on the slides either. The natural way to think about a sort of send-receive application of this, an application of this model to memory is to have a view of memory in which definite marks are made, and there's a physical separation between the mark and the thing that reads or interprets or makes use of the mark. So a read-write memory structure. Now, many people in neuroscience think that's exactly the wrong way to think about memory, that there's a kind of entanglement or non-separation between the representation and the representation user. And if a person thinks, for example, that long-term potentiation of synapses is the thing that is the basis for memory in our brains, then they'll be pressing on this. They'll be saying, hang on, I mean, when you change a synapse, in a way you're sort of storing a representation, but in a way the thing that you're changing is the interpreter or the user as much as it is the representation. So there's a nice quote from Christoph Koch where he says, look, one thing we've learned about the brain is that there's no separation in brains between representations and representation readers. And if that's true, that's a respect in which you only have a sort of imperfect or marginal realization of the model in the neural architecture. Now, there are people who think that can't be true. So Randy Gallistel and Adam King's book about memory from a few years back is the whole point of this long book is to say it can't be like that. The brain has to contain something more like a read-write memory where marks are made and they're stable and they're consulted later by a different object. Otherwise, we could not compute the things that we do. Now, adjudicating the debate between someone like Koch and someone like Gallistel is not something I could do here or elsewhere. I think this is a large-scale neuroscience question. What we can do is map the question onto the framework here and say, right, so Gallistel is saying that the memory in the brain, not just humans but other animals too, memory in the brain has a read-write structure that conforms rather faithfully to a send-receive model. Koch is saying, no, it doesn't. It works differently because you have entanglement or failure of separation between representations and readers of representations. That's the part. So I think the part case has its own interesting questions of that sort. In the stages case, I can't sort of add that kind of, detailed commentary. I think we certainly have a situation where, with respect to human beings, our lives are not divided really into stages. If we were butterflies with the metamorphosis step, you could say, right, there's an early stage and a later stage. There's caterpillar and butterfly and a natural divide, and we can say, to what extent does the earlier stage lay down some usable mark that a later stage can then come back and read, and to what extent does it not do so, and might it do more of it? Now, in the case of caterpillars and butterflies, they metabolize nearly everything in the body across the divide, so I suspect there's nothing like this actually happening. But the question there would be more neatly posable. I accept that in the case of humans, where there's no natural separation between stages of that sort, it's a bit more artificial to apply the model. On the other hand, the act of making a mark creates a distinction between a sender and any later stage who comes along and then has the opportunity to read or interpret or make use of the mark. So a read-write system is a send-receive system, I think, in the relevant sense, even though a read-write system can be one where the only natural divide between the reader and the writer is created by the act of actually making the trace.
Creating barriers, as artificial as they are probably sufficient to make the whole thing work.
Well, there are acts. So, suppose you write yourself a note, and then you come back the next day and read it. That fits the send-receive model, and you yourself need not be markedly different from across those 2 days. It's just that by making the mark, you established a certain relationship between everything present at that time and everything that is present at various later times.
Accumulated so many comments or questions that I dropped them. So here's one. When I saw the title of this talk, one thing that I imagined was like the beginning was using thinking about memory as communication to explain why we have false memory, why we have maybe errors in memory, and it's easy to imagine how that might have gone. But I haven't actually heard any. I mean, there are a few things that you've said that are relevant to questions of memory error, but I wondered if you have any bigger conclusions about.
Well, part of the middle. So if you accept that interests of stages can predictably diverge, and that earlier stages often do things designed to constrain later stages. For example, commitment devices of various kinds are attempts by early stages to constrain later stages. Then you might say, well, why not control the flow of information? If you believe you're going to do something different, you're going to want something different later on, why not constrain the later stage by controlling information rather than controlling behavior directly? And then I tried to suggest that it's very hard to do that using regular onboard memory systems. It's something that I think we sort of could do if we would do if we could, but I think it's very hard to do. It's just a fact about the material continuities between present and future stages that it's very hard to successfully deceive later selves. You can do things that make it less likely that a later self will have access to any information of a certain kind, and I think we do that. So we do that. But to create a false memory, it's no accident that science fiction films and films like Memento made a lot of effort to sort of make the scenario viable. Deceiving yourself requires a whole lot of, and Memento is full of flaws. I mean, there's all sorts of inconsistencies in that film. There are things he shouldn't be able to do given the assumptions of the film, which he can do. So to try to build a scenario where genuine intertemporal deception is possible is not an easy thing to do. It's quite a difficult thing to do.
But then we do have false memory.
Well, on any view of memory, there'll be just imperfections that arise because we, errors, performance errors, or we don't do everything we might. We don't do everything as well as we might. I take it that the regular old information storage view has no problem with explaining failure of various kinds, and the communicative view will explain similar sorts of failures in similar sorts of ways. It's a feature of the communicative model that it opens up very directly the possibility of deception. And then I say, I think it's hard. I think I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we do, in fact, have hidden mechanisms by which earlier stages can successfully deceive, not just keep information away from, but actively create false beliefs in later stages. I take it that's not how life is. Maybe my life is like that. I take it that it's hard for us to do, but if we could, I think we would.
I'd like to just make a very short reply to that. So I was wondering about the possibility of deception in cases where the interests don't differ. So,
right.
And in sort of regular communication, of course, there are places where this can be fine.
Right.
I want you to get out of the building fast. It's in your interest to get out of the building fast because something complicated is not going wrong if I just yell fire.
Yeah. Yeah, it's complete common interest, but deception nonetheless does a useful thing.
So I wonder whether that kind of model might allow the formation of false memories that are false almost immediately.
I think the identity function literature is essentially a case of that, where unlike the cases with commitment devices and so on, sender and receiver want the same sorts of actions at the later stage. They want perhaps some certain kind of confidence or coherence in actions at the later stage. The sender is able to act in ways conducive to that by enabling a kind of massaging of the past that makes us seem more coherent in our behaviors than we really are. No one here, everyone here is on the same page as far as interests are concerned. It's not a situation where I want different things to happen than my future self will want. It's not like a commitment device situation. But nonetheless, mutually beneficial deception might be engaged in. Now, I take it that that's hard to do too. If I tell myself, I went to this party and everyone thought I was fantastic, knowing that my future self will benefit from that, but knowing that at the time that I don't really think that's how things went, that's not going to be very convincing much of the time to my future self. So as Wilson and Ross say, this is quite a subtle thing. It can't be a sort of blatant inflation. The identity function of memory has to be achieved by a kind of gentle massaging.
Well, that's all the questions. So as a little token of our appreciation,
Thanks.
goodie bag.
Okay. I'll have to answer those. Thanks.